We're going to talk about Sikhism and its foundations today. And as I do often, what I want to do is I want to begin with some broader considerations.
Sure.
Um, and first, I want to begin with just a few comments on what are some of the early sources for the study of Sikhism. So now, when I say early sources, I'm talking about early secondary sources. I'm not talking about primary sources. I'm not talking about the Guru Granth Sahib, which I'll get to, which is the holy book of the Sikhs, because that begins to be put together centuries before what we might describe as, scholarship, which really begins about 200 years ago. One of the first works we have, and all of the early works are all by Europeans. I don't
Okay.
know personally. It may be that someone who's a real specialist on Sikhism, which of course I'm not. I mean, I know a fair bit about the religion, and I've taught it, and I've read good portions of the Guru Granth Sahib, uh, and I'm familiar with colonial sources because of my decades of work on colonialism. But as far as I'm aware, I don't think there are Sikh scholars who themselves were writing about Sikhism as early as the Europeans were. The Europeans were the first people to do it. Uh, and we have a work by a man called Sir John Malcolm, who was actually a very important figure in colonial India. We'll encounter his name later on, much later on, when I get to the subject of British India. But he was a professional civil servant. But this is before the Indian civil service had really been formed. So he's working for the company. Remember that up till 1856, 1857, the British officials who were working in India until 1857, these are employees of the East India Company, and technically, all right. So he's an employee of the East India Company. He's governing substantial parts of central India, for example, and he writes a book called Sketch of the Sikhs in 1812. The next big work we have is by a man called Captain J.D. Cunningham. The captain there should indicate to you that he was working for the military branch of the East India Company. He's basically a military man. And he's involved with the Anglo-Sikh wars, about which you know nothing at this point in time, but it's not necessary to get into it at this juncture. The consequence of that is that he's actually in close contact with the Sikhs over a period of 8 years, from 1838 to 46. And he writes a book called History of the Sikhs, which is going to be published in 1849. And there'll be a second edition in 1853. Both of these editions, the first and the second edition, are banned by the East India Company. And why are they banned by the East India Company? Because the company's officials see every time that a person who was working for the company wrote a book, that the company would vet the volume, they would review it. It's like, if somebody has worked in the White House, as I'm sure you know, that if they publish a book having to do with American politics and with the politics of the administration they're working for, before they can publish the book, there needs to be meet the approval of the White House. They have to vet it. So there's an independent agency in the United States which will do that. Uh, Partly because, for example, the person might reveal inadvertently, even sometimes maybe deliberately, official secrets. So here, similarly, the company would vet the volume, and they said, no, this doesn't pass our scrutiny because this book is too favorable to the Sikhs. And remember, the British are fighting a war where they're vanquishing the Sikhs, and so they certainly didn't want an account of the Sikhs which made them look too favorable, right? The next important date in understanding the sources, colonial sources, is 1869, when a scholar by the name of Dr. Ernest Trumpp is from the University of Munich. Okay, and he is um, the Regius Professor of Oriental Languages. He is going to translate the Guru Granth Sahib, that is the holy books, okay, the holy book. He's going to be commissioned by the Secretary of State to do so. All right. By the way, it just occurred to me, I'm not entirely sure, so that I think I'm not sure that this is actually being recorded by my side. So let me, if you don't mind, let me just take a minute to just make sure that it is actually being recorded. Uh, okay, okay. Did I? No, it is being. Okay, okay. All right. Sorry. Um, okay, where is it? Yeah. Okay. So we have this work by Ernest Trumpp. Now, Trump begins to do the translation, but in 1871, that is 2 years after he started, he comes to the conclusion that the language of the Granth Sahib had already become obsolete to a great extent. Okay, so he's talking about the fact that the language that is used at that time is a language that is no longer, from his point of view, no longer something that can be understood by the majority of the Sikhs. What this means is that, in fact, he's suggesting that, look, I'm not quite certain what the value of translating this work is. Okay. And I'm going to actually, and if I'm going to translate it, I'm going to translate it into a very modern form of language. The net conclusion is that when he finally finishes his conclusion, his translation in 1877, the book is received very critically by the Sikhs. Now, because it's received very critically, the company becomes quite concerned. Let me explain why. And then we move to the last and most important person in the colonial period, who's going to write a massive study which remains highly influential down to the present day. But why is it that the company was concerned by what Trumpp was saying? And more importantly, far more importantly, they're concerned that the Sikhs are saying that, look, this man has actually done a discredit to the faith. The company is concerned because the Sikhs constituted the most important part of the army of British India. Now, think of it this way. Even in the 1960s and 1970s, after India had become independent, 20% of the army in India was comprised of the Sikhs. Okay, sometimes the figure that is given is even higher, 25%, 30%. I'm just taking the lower end of that figure. What is their proportion of the population? Their proportion of the population is 2 to 3%. So the company is very concerned because their view is, if the Sikhs are going to be offended, we are relying upon them. We don't want to actually aggravate the religious feelings of the Sikhs, because they're feeling that their religious sentiments have been hurt by this very bad translation of their holy book.
And Vinay, did you say that? Did you say in British India the majority of the army was Sikhs?
No, not the majority. I'm saying that disproportionately. That I'm saying that the Sikhs form only 2 to 2.5% of the population, but 20 to 30% of the army is comprised of Sikhs. So they're because you would say, if you were to do it proportionately, then you'd say, well, 2 to 2.5% of the army should be comprised of the Sikhs, right?
That's post-independence, right?
No, but I'm saying as late as post-independent period continued to be. But this is true going back all the way to the 60s, 1860s. Okay? And how that came to happen is an extraordinarily interesting story. I'll just give you the short form of it. The short form of it was that in 1857-58, you had what was called the Great Rebellion, right? Known in colonial texts as a Sepoy mutiny, sometimes known as the Indian mutiny, but it's an Indian rebellion of 1857-58. Now, in this rebellion, the Sikhs gave their cooperation to the British, not to the rebels. All right. They gave their cooperation to the British. After the rebellion was crushed, the Sikhs were going to be rewarded. And one of the things that the British did was they put together this theory where they said you can divide all Indians into two groups of people, the martial races and the non-martial races. The martial races are those who are people who belong to tribes or communities or clans, whatever word you wish to use, that have a heritage of being warriors. They're fighters. And from their point of view, the Sikhs were natural warriors. Okay, these are the martial races, as they're called. There are going to be a number of other martial races as well. One of the most famous of these martial races, as the British described them, whether they are actually intrinsically or inherently martial races or not, of course, is a matter of social construction. It's not like some people are born to fight. All right, but that was a colonial view. And the reason they came around to that view was that they said, the people who betrayed us during the 1857-58 rebellion are these effeminate, these womanly Hindus, for example. Okay, they're not martial people. The Gurkhas are martial. That's one of the more famous examples. And so actually the Gurkhas from Nepal, right? The British even formed a whole regiment, which still exists to the present day in the Indian Army. Okay, and existed in the British Army. So the Sikhs are these martial races. And so this is one reason why the British are concerned. They're saying the future of our army now, post mutiny, after they've crushed the rebellion, is to a disproportionate extent in the hands of these Sikhs. They're only 2 to 3% of the population, but they constitute 20 to 30% of our army. We have to make sure that we don't hurt the sensibilities of the Sikhs. All right? So when this Trumpp translation came out, and it's received very critically by the Sikh community, which finds it very offensive, saying that the translations are inaccurate, incomplete, etc. What the British decided to do was they decided to commission another translation. And they commissioned, okay, not just a translation, but a very voluminous history of the Sikhs. It is done by a man called M.A. Macauliffe. Who is M.A. Macauliffe? He's basically working for the Indian Civil Service. He's a British official stationed in India. He has some interest in Sikhism. They knew that. In fact, he's going to convert to Sikhism. He's a Britisher who's going to convert to Sikhism. Okay? So it's a very fascinating history of Macauliffe himself. That's going to take us way beyond what we want to really do here. What we want to look at is his contribution very briefly and why his contribution is an enormous problem. Okay. Now, so the contribution is called The Sikh Religion, a massive work in 6 volumes that he writes. Okay. Now, let me say 2 things before I move to give you some quotations. Okay. The first is that the views that I'm expressing here are views that many Sikh scholars will not accept. Some will, a minority. The many that will not are those who are convinced, and that brings me to the second point, which is really the critical point here. The ones who are going to take a very different view than the one that I'm going to give you on some of these points, especially this particular point, are those Sikhs who are of the view that Sikhism is a distinct religion. It is a wholly distinct religion. That is their view. Okay. My view of the matter, and this is the view that I am going to suggest to you, was the predominant view in India for 400 years, and it is still the predominant view among Hindus. It is the predominant view among those who have an understanding of how religion actually works on the ground. And that view is that Sikhism is distinct in some respects, but it should be viewed as a religion which emerges from Hinduism and continues to have much in common with Hinduism. And that therefore it is very difficult to draw the line between who is a Sikh and who is a Hindu. Now, let me put it to you in a very colloquial way and see if you will share the view that I'm going to give to you. So, you're living in Bombay, let's say, or you're living in Delhi. How do you know that you are encountering a Sikh? Most often, you know that you're encountering a Sikh man because the man is turbaned. And then he may wear a kada, which is this kind of steel bangle around his wrist. Okay. But let's supposing that the person was not wearing a kada, and let's supposing that this person was not turbaned, and let's supposing that the person was clean shaven, which, by the way, many Sikhs are. Many Sikhs are. There are some Sikhs who do not observe what we might call the symbols of the faith, the outer symbols of the faith. Well, how do you know then? Can you distinguish a Sikh male from a Hindu male? The answer is you can't. It is the external symbols of the faith. Okay, it's the external symbols of the faith. Now, of course, you could say, well, what does that really demonstrate? Well, what that really demonstrates, as we're going to see, is that since the founding of Sikhism, one of the questions that has persisted for centuries is exactly just who is a Sikh, actually? And what is it that makes Sikhism really different from Hinduism? The same question I would submit to you must be asked apropos of the Jains. Remember what I had mentioned when we talked about Jainism months ago, that yes, Jainism is a distinct religion, but it also shares many features with Hinduism. And in fact, actually, the Sanatan Dharam view, that is the Hindu view, about which the Constitution of India is quite ambivalent, as I had pointed out months ago. It's ambivalent because on the one hand, it recognizes that Sikhism, Jainism, Buddhism are three religions which have come out of the soil of India along with Hinduism, and these three religions really have Hinduism as their parent religion in some respects. But in other respects, they have actually established a clear, distinct identity of their own in some respects. Jains and Hindus, for example, the overlap is enormous, even down to the present day. Now, Sikhism, the question is more acute, more pressing than it is in the case of Jainism for reasons that we'll get around to. But the main point here is that Macauliffe's book, and I'm going to give you two quotations, is a book that's going to set out to establish that Sikhism is completely a different religion. In fact, to the extent that he's going to more or less suggest that it has nothing to do with Hinduism, which is a view that unfortunately many Sikhs came to accept because this was the way in which they saw themselves establishing their own identity. And yet, a very large number of Sikhs were very comfortable in the view that Sikhism and Hinduism were not simply related religions, but that Sikhs and Hindus were in many ways actually indistinguishable. And it is a documented fact, which no Sikh can actually deny, because it's really documented by the ethnographic evidence, that is, by what people have observed with their eyes and what they've written about, which is that in the Punjab, until very recent times, and we'll come to that later on, why it changed beginning about the late 1970s, 1980s. In the Punjab, it was very common that in one family, one child may be raised as a Sikh and the second as a Hindu in the same family. It was very common. Now, that is less likely to happen today. All right. So Macauliffe publishes this massive volume, a 6-volume set called The Sikh Religion. Now, to understand why this book, which becomes so crucial for the Sikhs, okay, why this study is a problem, look at these quotations from here. Okay, I'm just picking out a little portion from both from volume 1. This is a passage I picked out. Let's parse it very carefully. So he says he quite recently met in Lahore some young men claiming to be descendants of the Gurus, who told me that they were Hindus. So this is Macauliffe, right? Who says that, I met people who were actually saying that they're descended from the Gurus. So they're not talking about ordinary Sikhs. You're talking about Sikhs who claim that they come from the line of the Gurus. And yet they tell Macauliffe that they're Hindus and that they could not read the characters in which the sacred books of the Sikhs are written. So there are 2 points here he's making. One, both of the points are really about the ignorance of the Sikhs. That's what he's saying. That they can't actually read Gurmukhi, the characters, that is the language of the Sikhs, which is Gurmukhi, okay? All right, the script. It's a different script. They're ignorant, so that it's like the modern day analog would be a child who's raised here, let's say an Indian child who's raised here and who doesn't know the mother tongue that his parents know, can't read Devanagari script, can't read Hindi, can't read Gujarati, whatever it is, right? That he's saying that he met these young people and young Sikhs who claim that their ancestors are the gurus, the Sikh gurus, and yet he's saying they can't read the holy books. And worse, they actually claim to be Hindus. All right. Whether the object of their tutors and advisors was or was not to make them disloyal, such youths are ignorant of the Sikh religion. Okay. They are ignorant of the Sikh religion. So you know what he's doing, right? What Macauliffe is doing. We've seen this so many times before. He's setting himself up as that European scholar using his European learning to teach the Sikhs about their own religion, their own history. This is what we started a year ago or 9 months ago, Orientalism, where the European is saying to the Indian, you don't actually even know your own history. You don't know your own religion. I know your history and religion better than you know your history and religion. I'm going to tell you what your religion is. Okay. And then, and I haven't given you the whole quote here. I should have continued. Okay. But he's going to say that actually, that there are these prophecies in the Sikh text in favor of the English, and it's of its prophecies in favor of the English. That the Sikh religion, he's saying, actually prophesies the coming of the English, that is, people like myself, who are going to be effectively your savior. So what I'm saying to you is that Macauliffe is actually going to set himself up as the true heir of the Sikh gurus. He has inherited their mantle. And you will see in 15 to 30 minutes why it's even more consequential than I'm making it out to be, because as you will see, the Sikhs only have 10 gurus, and then the 10th guru declared there are going to be no more gurus after me. The only guru will be the holy book. But Macauliffe himself is setting himself up now as a guru of the Sikhs, right? And here, again, from the first early pages of volume 1, he has a comment. Let's look at this one over here. Some of the Sikh states, in ignorance of the teachings of the gurus, have maintained temples and spiritual arenas at Haridwar and Rishikesh for the reception of pilgrims. See, Haridwar and Rishikesh were the holy place of the Hindus, right? And he's saying that, look, the Sikh states, okay, which had, these are independent Sikh states, okay, which, we haven't gotten around to the portion of British India, but when you look at British rule in India, there were large portions of India which were directly under British rule, and then there were some portions which were called the native states. So Mohandas Gandhi, for example, came from a native state, which was not technically under British rule. right? But there were these treaties that existed between the British and these native states. So you had these native Sikh states, and he's saying that the rulers of these, that is Sikh rulers, in ignorance of the teaching of the gurus, have maintained temples, right? And spiritual arenas at Haridwar and Rishikesh. And these are these are cities that are holy to the Hindus. He's saying, why are these Sikhs actually setting up their own gurudwaras in these places? At Haridwar, there are held great religious fairs every 12 years at the time when the sun enters the lunar mansion of Aquarius. That's what's called the Kumbh Mela. It is calculated that at least 100,000 Sikhs were present at the last great fair at Haridwar. All these pilgrims bathe in the Ganges. Now you see what he's saying. He's saying that look at the Sikhs, they are relapsed Hindus. Basically, these people have fallen back into the religion they came out of. They're really, frankly, Hindus. They just claim to be Sikhs. They take a dip in the Ganges at Haridwar just like the Hindus do, right? Right. So you see what his endeavor, apart from setting himself up as a kind of a savior of the Sikh people, setting himself up as a guru, saying that, look, I know the true scholarship, I know what your religion is really about. The constant emphasis in these 6 volumes is going to be the Sikhs should learn to distinguish themselves from Hindus, because Sikhism is an wholly distinct faith. And my submission to you is that is not the case, which is not to say that there isn't something that is different about Sikhism, nor is it to say that Sikhism should be viewed simply as a sect of Hinduism. But there can be a third way. The third way is to say, well, there is a kind of a family resemblance. Okay? A term I take from the great European philosopher Wittgenstein, who spoke about what he called family resemblances, when you have 10 terms which kind of mean the same, so therefore they have a family resemblance. But then, if they all mean exactly the same, why do we have 10 different words? The reason we have 10 different words is because there are some differences. Okay? There are some differences. And that is what is really happening here with Sikhism and Hinduism. But in order to understand that, we first have to go back now to the rudiments of the faith. All right? So remember all of this, and remember that it's going to be a real question. How does one actually identify a Sikh? What makes a Sikh different than a Hindu? Particularly when the Sikh removes the symbols of the faith. So, so that you understand the urgency, the sheer urgency, immediacy, the potency of this formulation, let me take you to the 1970s, and then we go to the life of Guru Nanak. 1970s, 1980s, when a great secessionist movement broke out, where Sikh militants demanded that a separate state be carved out for the Sikhs. All right? Because they were not able to get a separate state for the Sikhs in 1947 at the time of the partition. The Muslims got it, they got Pakistan. The Sikhs did not get it. Right? And of course, part of the reason they didn't get it, although that's not how many of the Sikhs look today, part of the reason they didn't, because there were many Sikhs who themselves didn't want it, because they didn't see themselves as being a different people who should be given a state, a religious state, which would become a country unto its own. There was no real demand among the Sikh masses for anything like that. Okay. Now, 1970s, when the Sikh secessionist movement breaks out, late 1970s, and in 1984, it's going to finally lead to the attack on the Golden Temple, because Sikh terrorists are going to be holed up in there, and they're going to stockpile this Golden Temple with enormous amounts of weapons. And the Indian Army, Indira Gandhi was a prime minister at that time. She is going to send the army into into the Golden Temple, into the most holy temple, and there's going to be a savage, severe gunfight, which I remember vividly from the news, and because I was in my 20s when this was happening in 1984. And they flushed out these terrorists. The secessionist movement is broken up, and then later that year, Mrs. Gandhi is going to be assassinated, murdered by her own Sikh bodyguards. I mean, it's an amazing story, right? But what were these secessionists or terrorists doing? They were killing not just Hindus; they were killing moderate Sikhs. They were killing their own religious brethren, who, in particular, they were killing those Sikhs who were not observing the symbols of the faith. Because the leaders of the Sikh secessionists, particularly a man called Bhindranwale, right? Bhindranwale said a Sikh is obligated to preserve the symbols of the faith. You cannot cut your hair. You must wear the turban if you're a male. You must. That was his view. But Nanak, for example, right, has nothing to say about any of this. And in fact, the turban is something that is going to come in much later on. Not even the 10th Guru said anything about the turban. But the reason Bhindranwala is saying is because he understood one thing. He understood, hey, if the Sikh doesn't wear the turban, if he's clean shaven, okay, and he's not wearing the kada, well, how do we even know he's a Sikh? That is the problem. All right. So I just want you to think about it. Now, how does this faith originate? And what are the circumstances? The circumstances, you have to take your mind back to the lecture on bhakti. So we had distinguished between Sagun and Nirgun bhaktas. Sagun is those bhaktas, those devotees who worship God in some particular form. Krishna, Ram, Vishnu, Shiva, right? And then the smaller number of bhaktas, the great devotees, who can be described as being on the path of Nirgun. Nirgun is God without form. And as I suggested to you at that time, Kabir is one of the great figures of that. We looked at him in very great detail. That, in fact, actually, Nirgun Bhakti, some scholars have argued, is an expression really of a different kind of the whole philosophy of Advaita, the philosophy going back to the Upanishads, okay, of a formless, transcendent God. Guru Nanak, therefore, is emerging at a time in a milieu where you have the Bhakti movement going on. And if you look at his dates, 1469 to 1538, so notice that he is born at a time when the Delhi Sultanate is around, right? And the Delhi Sultanate will terminate in 1526. So he lives beyond the beginning of the Mughal Empire. And in fact, we will look into this later on. There is a story, not fully verified, not fully documented, but many scholars believe that it's quite likely that Guru Nanak actually met Babur, the founder of the Mughal Empire, that they had a personal meeting at some point, but it cannot be fully verified. But that's the milieu. So Islam is the dominant religion in North India, and then you have the Bhakti movement. That's the milieu. He's born in a place called Talwandi. This is in Punjab, to a couple by the name of Mehta, Kalu, and Tripta. As we have seen of what is true of, as we have seen of many other religious figures of his stature, the Buddha, Mahavira, Shankaracharya, if you remember, the story is that there were auspicious signs of his birth right from the outset. Okay, that's the story. So in other words, what I'm doing is I'm actually identifying not only the fact that there is a common kind of thread that runs through these kinds of lives, right? What I'm also identifying is the fact that it's that many of the stories we have about his birth and his upbringing and all of that, these are what we would call hagiographies. Okay, so these are devout biographies, and therefore you have to take them with some degree of, not suspicion necessarily, but some degree of restraint. That is that, you can't be absolutely certain, some degree of doubt here, okay, about what exactly were the circumstances under which he was born. So in his case, for example, it is said that the family Pandit said that Nanak would become a great prophet. All right. So, if you become a great prophet, then you write that history back, as it were, right? Now, in any case, in 1485, he is going to be married. Why is he going to be married at this age of 16? Remember one thing, 16 was not a young age to marry at that point in time. We forget that very often, because today it's a criminal offense to marry um, under the age of 18. But at that time, the life expectancy was probably about 25 to 30 at most. I mean, it was 30 as late as 1941, believe it or not, in India. At that time, life expectancy was quite young, although what generally happened was that if you survived the first 10, 15 years, then you would live as long as people live now, almost, very often. The problem was that there were a huge number of people who died in their infancy, huge number of people who died in their infancy and in their early years. Um, so, marriage at that early age was common, but it's also because, according to the story, Nanak was, as a child, he was precocious. That is, he was viewed as being extremely, extremely intelligent, all of that. But that, he had the ways of an adolescent. He was not responsible for all of that. And so his parents did what, even in India today, this is what people do. If you want to bring a young man to his senses, make him feel a sense of responsibility, you do what? You get him married off. The whole theory being that, well, this is how you turn a boy into a father. The minute he gets married, within 9 months he's going to be a father, and this is how you make men or boys. Okay, right? So this is really the story of his marriage. I think if I remember correctly, I think his wife's name is Sulakani or something like that. Anyhow, he gets married. He takes a job at the state granary of Daulat Khan Lodi, who is a local magnate in the area, and he starts working over there. He works there for a long period of time, but in the 12th year of his employment, so he would have been roughly around the age of 28, something like that, he is falsely accused of embezzlement. And at that point, he says, I'm going to renounce this worldly life. Uh, he fails to show up at his home, uh, uh, and claims that he has now received a divine command to speak in a new language. Now, when I say a new language, I mean two different things. One, literally a new language, that is Gurmukhi, okay, um, which is the language of the Punjabi Sikhs, right? It's a script, um, and literally it is the language from the mouth of the gurus. Gurmukhi, Mukh is mouth, right? Language from the mouth of the gurus, right? But it's also a new language because at this point in time, circa 1500, right? We're talking, just a tad, maybe a couple of years before that, circa 1500, Hindus and Muslims, remember what Kabir is saying, they are set in their ways. You have the Hindus, you have Muslims. Yes, there are lots of different kinds of, quote, Hindus. No one called himself or herself a Hindu, as I've said so many times at that point. And there are, obviously, among the Muslims, there are the Shias, and then there are the Sunnis, and there are many different kinds of Shias. But on the whole, you say that, yeah, the Muslims follow the Quran, the Hindus follow the Vedas. or other Hindu holy texts, the Muslims are circumcised, the Hindus are not. And so therefore you say that, well, there's a way of distinguishing between the two. So it's a new language. When I say that he says that he has received a divine command to speak in a new language, I mean also that he had received a command to speak in the language neither of the Hindus nor of the Muslims, that I am going to show a third path. That is what he's claiming to do. That is, he declares that he's neither a Hindu nor a Muslim. So he's now given up his life as a householder. He's left the home, he's left his wife and children, and he has two children, two sons, and he becomes an itinerant preacher. We notice, by the way, that, excuse me for a moment. Okay, we would recall, and I would want you to notice that this is exactly what happened in the life of the Buddha and Mahavira. Right? They renounce the life of the householder and they become itinerant preachers. So all three of the faiths which are linked to Sanatan Dharam, that is to Hinduism, in Sikhism, Buddhism, Jainism, in all three cases, we have an itinerant preacher, someone who's going to move around. Nanak is going to move around with his childhood friend, who's a Muslim by the name of Mardana. And in the village of Saidpur Gaon, he acquires his first disciple, a man by the name of Lalo. What is it that Nanak is? Because if you might think to yourself, he is acquiring disciples, but what is it that he's preaching? What he's preaching is exactly what Kabir was preaching. Right? And preaching is not really the right word because they're not really proselytizers in that same sense. They're not like Christian preachers. That is, he's going around and he's got these compositions. Now, some of these compositions and hymns will go into what is going to become the holy book of the Sikhs. All right, we're going to turn to that in just a few minutes. Right? But to give you a sense, rather than quoting from his own writings, I want to quote to you something that is said by one of the gurus, one of the Sikh gurus later on, a guru by the name of Arjan. Okay. And this tells you a little bit about what the Sikhs were going to be commanded to do, how Nanak was actually thinking. Because remember that there are no Sikhs at this point. Nanak is now going to be the first Sikh, so to speak, right? He's going to create this new faith. And this is what Guru Arjan Dev said. I do not keep the Hindu fast, nor the Muslim Ramadan. I serve him alone who is my refuge. Him meaning that transcendent God, right? I serve the one master who is also Allah. I have broken with the Hindu and the Muslim. I will not worship with the Hindu, nor like the Muslims go to Mecca. There is no, in other words, he's saying, I don't worship with the Hindus. I don't worship with the Muslims. There is no such place like the Mecca for me. I only serve him. Okay? Which what the Upanishadic sages would have called Brahman, right? I shall serve him and no other. I will not pray to idols. That is, I'm not going to pray to Vishnu, Ram, Krishna, Shiva, Durga, Saraswati, whatever, nor say the Muslim prayer. I shall put my heart at the feet of the one supreme being, for we are neither Hindus nor Muslims. This is Guru Arjan Dev. This is effectively what Nanak is really saying. Now, as he moves along, just to give you a few more incidents from his life, because we need to get some sense of what kind of life he had. And it is very important to remember.
And quick thing, you said a while ago that average life expectancy at that time was, you said 30s?
Oh, even less than 30, 25, 30. The reason I'm giving you a figure 25 to 30 is we don't actually have any figure. We don't have any studies which show what the life expectancy was at that point, but we do know from 1870 onwards what life expectancy in India is, because that's 1871, we have the census, 1881, 1891, every 10 years we have the census. And therefore we know what the life expectancy was. And believe it or not, in 1941, the last census before the partition of India, life expectancy in India was 30.
But does that count infant mortality?
It's, when you say life expectancy, we're taking the average. Life expectancy, which accounts for everything, loss, deaths from plague, from epidemic disease, infant mortality, everything. This, if 30, and this is not distinguishing between males and females, because generally life expectancy, as you know, is a bit higher for females than it is for males. And in India, by the way, a lot of these things are reversed. For example, COVID deaths are substantially higher in most of the world for men. In India, that is not the case right now. There are more women than men who are dying from COVID in India. But that has to do with the general care that women and females get, which is substantially less than what males get. Okay? Yeah.
In this 1941 life expectancy in India, 30 years old, what was it like in developed countries at that time? Just out of curiosity, like
almost double in almost double in Britain. Yeah. Australia, for example, double of what you have in India. Double is enormous difference. So today, for example, the difference is far less, right? A life expectancy in India today is about 66, 67, and it'll be higher for women than it is for men on the whole, even in India as a whole, but only the difference is much less. In countries like Japan, Australia, Britain, France, the United States, 5 countries, developed countries, life expectancy for women is on the average about 4 times more than it is for men. Okay. And so the difference between life expectancy in India and the United States, I don't have the figures at my fingertips, but it's about 13 years roughly today. Okay. At that time, we're saying the difference would have been double. Enormous life difference, enormous difference. Okay. So now, so going back then to Nanak, I'm saying, he's an itinerant preacher. He's moving around Punjab and North India, but he's not only moving around Punjab and North India, he undoubtedly traveled quite extensively. Okay, and in fact, he says in the Guru Granth Sahib, page 156. So by the way, make a note of the pages, because when the Guru Granth Sahib is printed, it is always printed with exactly the same page numbers. All right. You see, if you look at this slide over here, the size of the book has been fixed at 1430 pages in Gurmukhi. So when it's printed, it's 1430 pages. All right. So because otherwise you might say, well, what edition are we talking about? It's like the Bible. I mean, it depends on, which the size of the print, this and that. No, here what we're saying is it's the same page. When I give you the page numbers, you just look up any edition and that's going to be the page number. All right. So he says, Nanak says, I have seen places of pilgrimage on river banks, including shops, cities, and market squares. I have seen all 9 regions of the world, weighing as a merchant. I love this. Weighing as a merchant the merits and demerits of each place in the scale of my heart. Right? So I go to all these places and I kind of weigh it. I weigh the merits and demerits of each place. Right? And what were the places that he visited? almost all of India, certainly all of North India, Sri Lanka, Central Asia, and so modern day Saudi Arabia, because he goes to Mecca. And I'll give you an episode from his trip to Mecca in just a few moments. And he says, Nanak says, page 145 of the Granth Sahib, when it pleases you, we go out to foreign lands. Hearing news of home, we come back again. It's really lovely, right? It's like the traveler who goes, and after a while, you get news of your country and you feel like going back, right? That's what he's saying. So he's an itinerant preacher. It also meant that he met people of all different religious persuasions, undoubtedly, right? He would certainly have met Muslims, and he would have met, if he was going as far as Mecca, he would have obviously met people who were Buddhists, because you had uh, portions of Afghanistan and there where you still had remnants of Buddhism, probably met Jews and Christians, right? Undoubtedly, I would say. So he was a man of the world in some ways, quite experienced. All right. Now, one of the more interesting stories, so I'm going to give you some stories from his travels, but each of these stories has a parable. All right. There's some larger meaning there. So there is an incident that takes place with this landlord. Uh, this landlord is right in the village where he is, okay? That area around where he is. His name is Malik Bhago. When Malik Bhago began to see that Nanak was acquiring a reputation as an itinerant preacher and all of that, he invites him to his home, and Nanak refuses his hospitality, and he's asked to explain why he has rejected the hospitality of the zamindar. And what he does is he takes out from his garment a dry crust of bread, okay? A dry crust of bread. Then he squeezes the sweets that Malik Bhago had put before him. So Malik Bhago had offered him hospitality. He refuses to touch the sweets, right? But he now picks up one of the sweets. And so the story goes that when he squeezed the sweets, blood came out of them. So the meaning of this parable is that your sweets, you have accumulated this wealth by squeezing out the blood of the peasants and the tenants working for you. And so the story goes that when he takes this dry crust of bread and presses it, drops of milk come out.
Drops of milk comes out.
Milk, yeah. That this dry bread, because this dry bread is from his disciple, Lalo. Lalo had given him. The sweets that Bhago, the big rich landlord, has given, when he squeezes those, blood comes out. All right? So that's a parable, of course, right? Much in the way in which, you find parables in the life of Christ, right? Similar kinds of parables. Now, while he's traveling, he arrives at Haridwar. Haridwar, we have encountered this place before. Remember what Macauliffe said, that the Sikhs are over there. Why are they taking a dip in the river? Because this is what the Hindus are doing. And Haridwar, that Haridwar, like, for example, if you're in Delhi, and you're from a Hindu family, then the cremation takes place. And then someone from the family, I did that, by the way, when my father passed away. My mother said, you have to take the remains, the ashes, and you immerse them in the waters of the Ganga. And the closest place really that is sacred to Delhi where you do that, really sacred, is Haridwar, or Haridwar, as it's said colloquially, right? Hari ka dwar, the door of Hari, Krishna, right? That's what the name means. Right? So he's traveling there, and he encounters these Brahmins. And when he sees these Brahmins, what are they doing? Right? They are throwing. They're standing in the Ganga and they're throwing water towards the sun, right? And Nanak says, "What are you doing?" Right? And they say, "We're appeasing the souls of our ancestors." So then Nanak picks up some water. He's standing in the Ganga. He starts throwing water in the opposite direction. And they say, what are you doing? And he says, I'm watering my fields in the Punjab. And they laugh. And then Nanak says, well, if you think that the water that you're sprinkling can reach the sun, you're worshiping your ancestors, it can reach the sun, then the water that I'm sprinkling should reach the fields. They're obviously much closer than the sun, right? So this is, so in other words, you see the witticism, right? He's doing what Kabir was doing, right? He's basically exploding, if I may put it this way, right? And exposing the absolute, the way he saw it, the hypocrisy and the idiocy of many of these ancestral customs which are adopted by people unthinkingly. But as is the case in Kabir, what is said of Nanak is that it's not like, okay, he's only going to demean the Hindus for their superstitious practices. He has the same view about the Muslims. So the story is told that when he was traveling, he arrives in Mecca. And when he arrives in Mecca, he's hungry, he's exhausted, he's been traveling for a while. He just sits down somewhere, and before you know it, he's fallen asleep. And then he's rudely awoken by a Muslim priest who shakes Nanak furiously and says, how dare you sleep with your feet pointing towards the Kaaba, right? The Kaaba is that, you've seen that, right? This big black, stone, all right? Okay, this is the Kaaba. So, there are no idols. You just have the Kaaba and you circumambulate the Kaaba in Mecca, right? And the priest says, how dare you sleep with your feet pointed towards the Kaaba, because your feet should never be pointed in that direction. So Nanak says to this Muslim priest, tell me, is there some place where God cannot be found? Why don't you point your feet towards some place where God cannot be found? And the story tells us that the Qazi was left speechless, because what Nanak was saying, well, why are you saying that God is only to be found in this direction? If God is everywhere, he's to be found in every direction. That isn't your Kaaba itself actually a form of idolatry? That's what he's really saying, all right? So these episodes indicate very clearly the nature of his life, all right? And I'll get to later on, if we have time, in a consideration of Sikhism, the question of whether he met Babur or not and what we know. But I want to cover more essential aspects right now, okay? So he is going to eventually settle down to the life of a farmer in Kartarpur at the age of 52, all in the Punjab, okay? And it is in Kartarpur that he is going to institute the practice of langar. Now, I have to speak about this institution for a few minutes, because this institution of a langar is very much not simply alive, it is completely intrinsic to the Sikh tradition. And this is where you begin to see where Sikhism was effecting a significant departure from some of the things that became associated with the Sanatan Dharam, that is, the eternal faith of the Hindus. Among Hindus, in view of the whole history of caste prohibitions and all of that, there were and still are, although to a lesser degree, very strict rules about who you eat with, who you share your food with. Because, of course, there was always the fear of contamination. And again, recall once again very vividly to your mind all of the expressions from Kabir, where he mockingly says, Pandit, watch it. Think about where you're, mockingly he's saying, right? This food that you're going to touch, do you know who touched it before, right? Because he's saying, hey, look at the Pandit, he's thinking that there's something called purity, something called impurity, all of that, right? And in everyday life in India, much more so than, for example, in the US. I think you'll agree with that. In India, there is a concept of juta even today. That if someone's been eating, even if they're a close friend, you don't eat from their plate very often. Okay, you don't share the food in the same way because it's juta, it's been spoiled, so to speak. Okay, so the rules of commensality, who one eats with, are actually quite critical. And I don't want to sort of like say that, well, hey, the only people in the whole world who observe rules of this kind are Hindus. No, I don't want to really say that, because would white people have shared their table with their black slaves? The answer is no, they would not have. Not at all. Right? But here, the practices among Hindus were such that many Hindus would not even share their food with other Hindus if they happened to be of a different caste. Now, therefore, what this practice of langar is very important, because what is it? It's a community kitchen, essentially. So the idea was that everybody shares food at the same table. And here I mean table both literally and metaphorically, but more metaphorically in the sense that actually, just keep this in mind. We'll get to it, back to it in a minute. The idea of a table, sharing food at the table, is actually a problem. Okay, from the point of view of understanding the institution of langar, because remember, at that time, and this is still very common in India, except in anglicized, westernized families, you generally you sit on the floor and you eat. You might put a bed sheet or something there, and then the whole family sits around at the floor and eats. Watch this beautiful film, which is about the partition of India, the best film ever made, one of the greatest films ever made in India, Garam Hava, and you'll see that scene where they're all sitting down, but you see that in many Hindi films. All right. So langar was, it doesn't matter who you are, whether you're Hindu, whether you're Muslim, whether you're upper caste, whether you're lower caste, everyone sits down together in a single row. And if there are too many people, then you form rows. So if you go to a gurudwara, any gurudwara anywhere in the world, unless it's so small that they don't actually have a community kitchen, they serve a langar, and it's completely free, down to the present day. Okay, so and they don't ask you who you are, whether you're a Sikh, whether you're a Hindu, whether you're Muslim, where you've come from. You just go there, and they may be serving 1,000, 5,000, 10,000, 20,000 people a day, a whole meal. That is the institution of langar, because the idea was everyone sits down here as an equal to the person next to him or her, and across him or her, and behind him or her. Right? That's the institution of langar. It completely unknown in India before this time, and completely unknown among the Hindus, and in fact unthinkable among them. All right. Now, just so that you understand, again, this is what I do characteristically, and you've told me that you like this sort of thing, so I give you the story here. You will not believe it, but in Vancouver, where you have a large, significant Sikh population, they've been in the news recently. The reason they've been in the news is because, there's a farmers' protest going on in India right now. And the Canadian government ventured to give an opinion on this, which really annoyed the government of India, really annoyed Modi, because the government of India said, you've got no business interfering in this matter. This is an internal domestic matter of India. Why did the government of Canada step into this whole discussion of the farmers movement and the protest against the 3 laws that were passed by the government of India a month ago, several months ago, right, having to do with the farming sector in India? Well, the Canadians stepped into it because British Columbia has a very large Sikh population. And so this is an important constituency for Canada, for every prime minister, right, for every politician. Right? Now in Vancouver, about 15, 20 years ago, there was an incident where a person was actually stabbed at a Gurdwara over this whole problem of langar. What happened? Very, very briefly, you have an aging population. A lot of these Sikhs, there are people who are now in their 60s, 70s, 80s. When you sit down for langar, you sit on the floor, as you do in a Gurdwara. There are no tables or chairs. One reason they are not is that when you bring furniture, you create hierarchies. Just like you create a hierarchy in an army when you bring horses and when you bring elephants, because a cavalry is superior to the infantry. Who sits down and who doesn't? Why did they bring in chairs? Because many of these elderly people were saying in Canada, these Sikhs at the Gurdwara, we're really kind of getting old and it's hard for us to sit in the Indian way. We haven't done it on the floor. It's much easier if we sit on a chair. Now, when you sit on a chair and then you put a table so you can put your lunch, your langar plate on that, here's a problem. Think of the English expression. You've heard the English expression, head of the table. Most tables are rectangular. Someone sits at the head of the table. To sit at the head of the table is to create a hierarchy. Of course, you can resolve this problem by having a round table. That's why sometimes, actually, in some institutions, which would like to have a more democratic setup, where you say, okay, we're going to have 10 people and all 10 are going to be viewed as equal, you do it around a round table. In 1931, there was a so-called round table conference. It was called round table partly because the idea was everybody would be treated equally. They weren't. That's a different matter. This is when India was negotiating for independence under Gandhi. Okay. But you've heard of the expression, head of the table. Someone sits at the head of the table. So one reason furniture creates its own hierarchies. And the Sikhs never had furniture at all. All right. So there a big fight broke out in this Gurdwara in Vancouver over this whole question of tables, chairs, furniture, and how this was violating the whole practice of langar. And in anger, someone actually stabbed another person. It was in the news. I mean, if you Google it, you'll probably find it somewhere, right? But this is the institution of langar that he created, which is really a kind of a community kitchen. And you can, and in the Golden Temple, which is the most famous Sikh shrine, we'll see that in a few minutes in one of the photographs. They serve langar to thousands of people every day. And if you see these photographs, these community kitchens, these woks in which their food is being cooked, these are massive, massive. I mean, they hold several hundred kilograms of whatever it is they're cooking, all right? So he sets up this particular institution. And one of the things he's going to do in the closing years of his life is he's going to appoint a disciple. Now, this is very important because generally what happens, it happens in businesses all the time. It happens in other institutions and politics, particularly in dynastic politics, of course, is people appoint their own children. And usually you appoint your own son. And usually where you have more than one son, you appoint the oldest son. The oldest son. Mr. Donald Trump is continuing that practice. Don Jr. is his oldest son and is kind of the heir to the throne of Trump, if I may put it this way. Right? So this idea of the oldest son, this is called inheriting the wealth, the throne, as it were, the title is called primogeniture. This is what it's called. So in religious sects as well, religious traditions and domains, that was a very common thing. Nanak did not take that view at all. He determined a simple test for who was deserving of leading the community. He drops his eating bowl, the bowl from which he would eat, he dropped it into a very dirty sewer. And one of his disciples by the name of Lehna fetches it, puts his hand into this dirty sewer in the midst of all this muck, digs it out, and washes it, and then hands it to Nanak. And Nanak says, "You shall be worthy, you are worthy of becoming my inheritor, right? You shall be my successor." And at Nanak's death, Lehna is going to be named the second Guru. He becomes known as Guru Angad. Nanak passes away in 1539 on September 22nd. We have precise dates because by this point we have a kind of a historiography. And true to their form, according to the Sikh tradition at least, the Hindus and Muslims, remember that the Nanak has all along been saying, I'm neither Hindu nor am I Muslim. I've got problems with both. I take something from both, but mine is not that he used the phrase third path, but that's in effect what he was doing. True to form, the Hindus and Muslims fight over his remains. Why? Because what do the Hindus want to do? They want to obviously, number one, they wanted to actually burn the body because that's what you do, you cremate the body. The Muslims obviously wanted to um, bury the body, right? And in the words of one couplet, uh, yeah, uh, Guru Nanak, the king of fakirs, to the Hindu a guru, to the Muslim a Muslim, a pir, right? So to the end, they use different words to characterize him. The Hindu said he's a guru, the Muslim said he's a pir. They both acknowledge him as a saint, but from the perspective of their own faiths. And it is said that when these Hindus and Muslims were tugging at the sheet covering his body, the Hindus wanted to take it away, right? They wanted to burn it. The Muslims wanted to bury it. They're tugging, they're pulling at the sheet. When they finally pull it away, what do they find? There's a heap of flowers, right? That's how the story goes, all right? So this is the life of Nanak. Now,